Please, 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 Elon Musk, Donald Trump, Uncle Sam, Milton Friedman, whoever happens to be listening at this moment, please do not do the Doge dividend. Okay, now that all the clickbaiters are here, let's talk about this. So, you might have seen in the news recently that there's been talk of a Doge dividend going around, specifically with the Department of Governmental Efficiency headed up by Elon Musk. Now, that might seem a little bit strange to you at first. Aren't they talking about getting rid of all of the different spending that we see in the federal government? Isn't that kind of what they're supposed to be doing? Right? Excuse me, my microphone tapped out there for a second. You would be right. They have, it seems odd considering what they are trying to do. I'm doing this live because I wanted to get this out immediately without having to take the time to edit it, especially considering how fresh this is. So let's talk about what's going on here. A couple of days ago, someone on X, formerly Twitter, named James Fishbach, the CEO and leader of Azoria, a free thinking investment fund, released the following. And I want to share my screen here so you can see this. This is what we're working with here. So let's go back to the beginning and I'm going to show you exactly what's going on. So this is James Fishbach. He released something called the Case for a Doge Dividend. And you can imagine that this is exactly what it sounds like. He's talking about giving 20% of Doge's total savings and returning it to the 79 million US households that pay federal income tax in 2025 as a tax refund check. Now, immediately I'm sure some of you are thinking that this is already going to be a problem, and there is a little bit more nuance to that than just simply, oh, this is bad. Now, if you're like me, you remember the insane price spikes we saw from a year of stimulus packages to begin with. So, is this similar? Are we going to end up seeing another, frankly, another supply shock? There's no other way to put it. Maybe. But before we jump into anything, I want to show you kind of some pointers and some things that I didn't expect when I first looked at this. So we're going to go here. I'm going to switch my screen again, and I'm going to show you kind of what I found out that's going on here. So the Doge dividend. So this rightly has some people riled up. Jeff Snyder said the other night, if we keep doing this kind of stimulus, we might as well call it UBI, Universal Basic Income, and forget that a free market economy exists at all. And he might be right. You know, looking at this from an outside perspective without taking in all the details or reading and thinking about the article in depth, you can see where that can easily come from. And to be fair, Jeff Snyder knows way more about this than I do, and so chances are he might be right. I read through the entire document just because I was curious to see what exactly Mr. Fishbach was trying to explain. And he did have 4 actual reasons for why he was thinking of doing this. And I think it's worth talking about them before we immediately jump to demeaning it, frankly. The first one that he talks about in this document is righting the wrong done to the taxpayer. And I think I'll read his words because he says it better than I ever could. He says, while roads and bridges in the American heartland crumbled and countless veterans were denied health care, U.S. aid used taxpayer dollars to feed Al Qaeda affiliated fighters in Syria, finance electric vehicles in Vietnam, and fund sex changes in Guatemala. You can look at his sources on the document itself, but this one freaks me out the most is that sex changes in Guatemala, the footnote is from whitehouse.gov. So there is clearly some problems going on with just that alone. And it makes sense. If we read a little bit further into this document that he put together, he explains that taxation is an implied bilateral contract between the taxpayer and the government. And frankly, it is. Taxpayers agree to pool their resources together and redistribute wealth in a certain way to do certain things. Now, I have my own feelings about taxes in general and the morality of them, but what he says at the end of this cannot be denied. Excuse me. Taxpayers work hard and pay their taxes in exchange for and in exchange, government renders services with accountability, honesty, and fairness. American taxpayers held up their end of the bargain, but as DOGE is exposed, the federal government did not, effectively breaching its implied contract with over 79 million taxpaying households throughout the United States. With this, with a breach of this magnitude, when a breach of this magnitude happens in the private sector, the counterparty, at minimum, refunds the customers since they failed to deliver what they promised. It's high time for the federal government to do the same and refund money back to the taxpayers. So that is fair. For people who follow me on LinkedIn or who listen to or read my articles that I post on Substack and LinkedIn, they will realize that we are not doing so well on the government front, especially when it comes to spending. The GAO, which is what this article is referring to, released an overall research paper about their findings when it came to specifically the audit trail for the federal government and the federal departments. The Pentagon failed for the 7th year in a row. The SBA loan and the Department of Education got what's called an exclamatory opinion, which basically means that they could not collect enough information in certain aspects of their financial statements to have a chance at passing an audit. And what scared me the most of all, I didn't know this before until I was reading this research paper that the GAO released. There are 24 departments in the US government that agreed to something called the Chief Financial Officers Act of 1990. And one of the things that is implied in there is strong controls specifically for information cybersecurity audit, and half of them did not have strong enough information system controls in place. So it is bad. Honestly, I was stunned when I found out about this because I knew that there was some level of corruption in the government. Anyone who reads a lot of, especially financial history, will see that. But I didn't realize it was this bad. This is that GAO report, and I'll happily link it in the comments, is damning. Anyone in the private sector who would be in that situation where they failed an audit that bad would be in financial hot water or worse. So there's a good reason why he's talking about this way. There has been some wrong done to the taxpayer, but as we're going to see a little bit later, I don't know if just throwing a bunch of money at people is actually going to fix the other problems going on around this. But let's jump to the second one first, and this is incentivizing tips. Now, this is not the 20% that you and I are now confronted with when we go to Costco or McDonald's or wherever. Specifically, what he's talking about is tips about government waste. Fishbox says this in his report: with the DOGE dividend, every tax-paying American now stands to benefit from DOGE. As such, they have an incentive to report every instance of government waste, fraud, and abuse that they encounter. This incentive will massively increase the surface area for DOGE to find opportunities to cut costs, further driving up DOGE's total savings and in turn the size of President Trump's DOGE dividend to taxpayers. So this is actually reasonable as well, to a certain extent. I have my doubts about incentivizing people to turn in tips to the government, but it has worked out well in the past. Kind of one of the biggest examples is the whistleblower program. This is something I didn't learn about until pretty late into my bachelor's degree, which is the SEC has a whistleblower program for fraud. And that whistleblower program has returned a lot. I mean, we look at this report from 2020 and 2019. It says original information provided by whistleblowers has led to enforcement actions in which the commission has obtained over $2.5 billion in financial remedies, most of which has been or is scheduled to be returned to harmed investors. So this is huge. And kind of a bit of background here. The reasoning behind this that the SEC had was oftentimes when fraud is occurring, you don't often get people speaking up because their job is on the line. And so what they wanted to do was to create an incentive system that would allow everyday individuals to turn in information about private fraud and then not lose their job or be financially worse off because of it. And Doge could actually do a similar purpose here with this dividend if that's actually what they were going to do. Obviously, like I said, there are problems coming and we are going to get to them. But Fishbach believes that giving out these dividends will incentivize people to report fraud in the government. And it very well might. If the average person behaves like the whistleblowers do, we could see more government fraud being reported. And it's desperately needed. The graph that you're looking at on screen, you've probably read it already, is public trust in the government. And it's at one of the lowest points that we've seen in history. It did start to tick up a little bit in Trump's first term, and it ticked up a little bit in Biden's term. And from what I've heard, it's going up as well in Trump's now term. I don't have the information to verify that though. That's just what I've heard thrown around on podcasts on the news. But still, this is a pitiful number. And it highlights something that I've talked about before, which people are just not buying the narrative anymore. And our government's credibility is falling because of it. Doge could fix that, or at least that's the idea. This one was a nightmare. So back to Fishbach's report here, talking about boosting tax morale. So for people who haven't heard of this term before, I'll explain it in just a second. President Trump's DOGE dividend can work to increase tax receipts by boosting tax morale, Fishbach says in his report. Tax morale in the political science literature is a measurement of taxation sentiment, whether taxpayers feel they are receiving adequate value in exchange for their tax payments. The literature has found that tax morale is directly linked to public trust in public-facing output government organizations that implement and deliver public goods to the citizenry. So he is right. From what I could find out, and I didn't include it here because I couldn't find actual data on it, but from the literature that I did read this morning about tax sentiment, that is true. If you have a federal government or an overarching government that people can trust and they can see that the government is taking care of the roads, they can see that the police force are protecting their neighborhoods, they are willing to contribute to taxes. And it also makes sense when you look at it from the other side, where you look at places like Venezuela, Argentina, where Javier Milei just took power. Those places dodge taxes all the time. And it's not because of some moral failing on their part. It's just when corruption is that rampant, you as a person cannot trust that it's going to get better. So why would you pay for it? However, there's a problem here that we need to discuss. And that is that the US has one of the highest voluntary tax rates. So the tax gap is an article. It's a concept, but it's also an article that the IRS released a few years back. And they looked at information from 2014 to 2016 was the newest that I could find. And this is what they found. The tax gap estimates translate to about 85% of taxes paid voluntarily and on time. Um, and it says here that the newest estimates are slightly higher. So after the IRS got involved, it was 87%, but before that, it was 83% to 85%, depending on the year. So we have people who just voluntarily pay their taxes at the moment. I'm not saying they all do it. I'm sure this is an aggregate number, but the point is we already have people who are highly incentivized to pay their taxes. Now, where Doge might come in handy is increasing that morale and increasing the percentage of people who pay taxes. Maybe we have yet to see, looking back, and I'm going to get to this in a second, but looking back on the stimulus checks that my friends got when we were in lockdown, it wasn't necessarily the case where they became better civil servants because the government was paying them money. So I doubt that, but the data suggests that maybe it might be the case here. Now let's get to the big one. So James's last point, his last benefit that he recommends, I disagree with. And the graph on screen shows you why. So what he says is, finally, President Trump's DOGE dividend will work to increase labor force participation by requiring individuals to be net taxpayers of federal income to be eligible to receive their DOGE dividend checks. As for just one example, 7 million working age men in America are either neither working nor looking for work. The prospect of a $5,000 DOGE dividend in 2026 will incentivize many to re-enter the labor force in 2025 in order to be eligible for the DOGE dividend. Low labor force participation has been throttling the U.S. economic growth, and the DOGE dividend will provide a powerful incentive to begin reversing this trend on the margins. Now, this is the problem where I run into with this, right? I've talked about on the Substack and on the LinkedIn newsletter, which you can go and read. I will list the links in the comments down below. Speaking of which, if you like this content and you would like to see more of it, I make 2 articles a week on this kind of content for those platforms. I only make about 1 video a month. There might be 2 because of the Doge dividend thing, but if you want more content and you want to help me to continue to build this, please go check out LinkedIn and Substack. It would help a lot if we could keep that growing. Anyway, back to the point. One of the things that I have talked about at length and has been covered by Jeff Snyder, Steve Van Meter, Patrick Boyle, and others is this idea that the labor participation rate, the level of unemployment, and specifically the data around those numbers is not exactly what it seems to be. And this graph just shows one piece of that. So if we assume that these are going to be cash payments and current government transfers, what do we notice here? So in the past, when we've had large relative spikes in government payments, we don't see the same large spikes in jobs. And my explanation for it, frankly, is because it's not a lack of consumer desire or somehow a lack of consumers' want for money that is keeping them from the job market. All the data right now suggests that either A, companies overhired after the pandemic because they were front run with all this money and people were supposed to keep buying, or B, it's AI. I'm actually a little bit more skeptical about the AI suggestion because when I look at the numbers for the companies who are implementing AI-based hiring cuts, they also have some serious financial straits. So I'm even suspicious of that, but frankly, there's nothing in these numbers. I mean, we can look at 2020 as the example here, right? So this is the lockdown right here on screen that you see with that large drop. And this big spike is the government trying to front run a possible recession by putting stimulus money in everybody's pockets. If stimulus checks and tax refunds would help people to join the workforce, you would have seen a larger spike after we came out of lockdown here. And that's not what happened. Similar here, though, to a much smaller scale, you see this small peak just after the housing crisis, and you see a slight decline, but you don't really see a peak at all. So, frankly, I disagree. It's far more likely that we are going to see, if this is a cash payment, again, if this ends up being a tax refund or a tax cut, sorry, if this ends up being a tax cut, a non-cash tax refund, then this could be a very different story. But if it's a cash check handed to Americans like Fishback is recommending, then we are going to see very similar to what we saw in 2022. And there's a couple reasons for that. In fact, I'm going to come back to this a little bit later because I want to show you this first. And that's because when you hand random stimulus to people, they're going to spend it. You know, I got a couple during lockdown. That's because my job was affected. And I did spend a little bit of it. I spent one of the 2 checks on a mountain bike, which I later sold to buy a wedding ring. But the other one I saved because in the back of my head, I didn't know if I was going to have a job afterwards. If my job was still going to be there when I got back, and prices were going up. We saw this exact trend as we look at government spending in red and then consumer spending in yellow. We see again, here's the front run. Here is when the US government shot up the amount of money that was going into people's pockets with stimulus payments, and you saw massive rises in spending. Now, not all of that was on mountain bikes and wedding rings like mine was. I know a lot of people who invested in stocks. They bought cryptocurrency and other things that are assets. But the thing is, it's just not going to do what Fishback says it's going to do. Instead, what will likely happen is prices will rise again because now there's more money in the system for the same amount of goods, and will probably lead to a lower labor participation rate as companies need to cut jobs as we make this whole situation that we have here worse. Finally, I wanted to touch on something that matters to me, and maybe doesn't matter as much to other people, but who is this actually going to go to? We're talking about net income taxpayers, and we see a very clear representation here. The people who are most likely to receive these benefits are the ones who actually pay the most taxes. And that is the 24, the 32, and the 35% tax bracket. Now, I'm not going to go as far as to say, oh, well, think of the poor people at the bottom, or this is some kind of conspiracy to put money in the pockets of the rich. It's just the nature of how it's set up. If they follow Fishback's recommendation, then the people who don't pay taxes, this 10%, or the 12% of people who pay very little taxes, they're just not going to get the same amount, even though that's the people who probably need it the most, given our current high price scenario. We can see this as well in just pure numbers perspective, right? So the Tax Foundation released a graph to show how much of the US population is paying each percentage. And take a look at what you see here. It says the same thing that I showed you on the previous graph. I just thought it showed a different representation of what's going on here. This dividend, if given in cash, is going to disproportionately affect the people at the high end of the curve when it comes to net income, while the people at the bottom who either don't pay taxes because their income isn't higher than the standard deduction, or only get a smaller proportion because they are not as well off, are going to take the inflation burden. Now, it doesn't stop there either, because one thing that I could not understand when they were talking about this was, where is this money actually going to come from? Because, as you might have guessed, a lot of these savings, which are awesome, I think if Doge does what it says it does, it's going to be one of the crowning moments of the 2020s in my mind. It's going to be such a powerful story for the world that we could actually reduce this government bloat. However, just because they're cutting doesn't mean they're finding money. And I can prove it to you right here, right now. So this is Doge's website. Department of Governmental Efficiency. They've got some pretty cool stuff on here. And they do walk over in detail. I have heard some conflicting opinions about this $55 billion number, concerns about double or triple counting, or contracts that were overpriced and then were never corrected when the true market price was found. But more importantly, as we go down this list, you start to see a lot of big numbers. 100,000, 200,000, $9.99 million, $25 million, Department of Agriculture, etc., etc. You can go down this list forever. And though it's really cool to see, what you're going to find out very, very quickly is a lot of this is non-cash. And the reason why is this is total contract value. This is what these contracts were worth when they were signed. This is the amount of money that was saved. Those numbers are very different. And sure, some of them matter. So these two that we saw before, these $9.99 million contracts we got back, this one, $25 million contract, those are nothing to sneeze at. But all these numbers that we saw before are zero, and that's because either A, the money was never there to begin with, or B, it's been spent. So in my mind, and I'd be happy to hear in the comments of people who disagree with me, I'd love to hear your counter opinion, there isn't money there. This is previous deadweight spending that has been found in the past that is now just gone. It's gone into the hands of who knows at other points around the world. And we can increase our savings by cutting it for the future, but there's not any money to give back to the taxpayer from those particular ones. I didn't go as far because I ran out of time to add up what all of this would be worth. But you can tell from all the zeros that it's significantly less than the headline contract value that's being said. So where does that leave us? I don't want to join the hate train of Doge. Like I said, I think there is some real possibility for benefit and growth here. I think Doge could do some amazing things. I remember when I first found out that Elon Musk was starting it, I was very impressed because Elon Musk's track record of lean operations puts him in the perfect role to do this. But this idea of a Doge dividend, in my mind, just does not work, at least not in cash. Now, tax cuts, that's a different story. And there could be, in my mind, an argument to say, yes, this would work out here. But given what Fishback has said in his actual proposal, I don't think this is going to work. Let me know in the comments about what your thoughts are on this. If this is the first time that you're hearing about this, I'll include a post with all the information where you can find the slide deck I built and the articles and things that I have listed. I'll list Fishback's name in there as well, so you can check this out for yourself and do your own research. This is the end of the stream. Thank you so much for stopping by to watch if you're watching this later, and let me know your comments on Doge below. Thank you, and have a wonderful rest of your week.